So is there anything you'd like to discuss?
So, what about morality? As awareness, there's pure acceptance of what is, and everything seems perfect as it is, and awareness cannot be disturbed by any experience or what happens in the conventional reality. So I can see why you told us about Krishnamurti saying about his highest teaching, I don't mind what happens. But where's the morality? From that place, is there anything that I care about the conventional world with all the suffering or wars going on in that outer reality when there's so only peace as awareness?
Okay.
So something seems to be missing, at least in my understanding.
Okay. If we consider all the actions that we consider to be unethical or immoral, they are almost all, if not all, perpetrated by people who believe that they are temporary, finite, limited selves. In other words, amoral or unethical action always comes from the sense of separation. And the activity that is undertaken on behalf of either aggrandizing or protecting that separate self. So in the absence of the feeling of separation, in other words, if one truly understands who one essentially is, that the actions, the thoughts and feelings, and the subsequent actions that flow through you or expressed through you are not conditioned or limited by the sense of separation, and therefore they are inherently intelligent, loving actions. In other words, this understanding is the source of all moral and ethical behavior.
I can see why that kind of liberation is a necessary condition for all that morality. But is it sufficient? For example, I guess we all have heard about some enlightened gurus having still some issues with power, sex, money, substances, where that kind of non-dual understanding, at least from my point of view, doesn't seem to have led them to behave in a conventional reality.
Well, maybe their non-dual understanding was not very deep or sincere.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you know they were enlightened gurus?
No, I don't.
Just because everybody tells you they are, or because they have a special name, or they surround themselves with photographs of all the great gurus, or wear orange clothes and have all the paraphernalia and trappings of a guru? You think that means that someone is automatically has recognized their true nature and behaves accordingly? Of course not.
But let's take another example. Let's take, you told us yesterday about Ramana Maharshi, and from what I understand, he's regarded as a very enlightened, non-dual teacher. But I've watched a movie about him, and he seems to have not cared about his body, for example. He seems to be very weak in his body. So I asked myself, well, if he still doesn't even care for his body, what made him care for the outer world and behave in a proper or moral way, care for other beings.
Yes, it's true that as far as the story goes, that Ramana Maharshi, when he was a relatively young, a boy still, age 16, had this very profound and complete recognition of his true nature, and it came completely unsolicited. There was no interest or spiritual practice. He had no teacher, or he just came across it. It was precipitated by the fear of death. Many of you know the story. And his recognition of his true nature was so complete and was so at odds with his previous knowledge or understanding of himself that it completely disorientated him. In his case, for many years. It took him many years, because he didn't have the help of a teacher. It took him many years to reconcile his new understanding of himself with his everyday life. And therefore he neglected his body, and somebody else had to look after him. And very slowly, over a period of years, he acclimatized to his new understanding and began to readapt to everyday life in the world. And that's a very extreme case. It very rarely takes place like that. And for most people, the process of investigation, the recognition of our true nature, the stabilization in our true nature, and the aligning of our life with this new recognition takes place in the company of a friend or a teacher who can help us or guide us at various different stages. And Ramana Maharshi didn't have this. He had to learn the hard way. But that's a very unusual case. For most people, there is some, for most of us, that there is some help in the form of a friend or a teacher to help us not only investigate our true nature, stabilize in the recognition of our true nature, but also to realign our life in all realms of our experience with this understanding. And that includes looking after our body, looking after our family if we have one, communicating or sharing this understanding or in some way, not necessarily by speaking, but in some activity in the world.
I wonder if there is some risk in that direct path that you're teaching, because that it seems to me like in the direct path, there's first the awakening, and then there's that acclimatizing or realizing or something still to develop.
Yes.
And whereas in a progressive path, maybe some of that kind of development takes place before the.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Sorry, carry on.
And so, I guess my question is, on what basis do I decide which is the right way for me? Like, for some, because I see that maybe there's that kind of awakening, and then I haven't gotten rid of all of my conditioning and my maybe psychological problems and shadows, and all these things come through, and with no separate self still in place, there's nothing that I fear, and I think I might even aggrandize myself like some of those gurus we talked about. So I'm wondering if there's some value in developing this kind of understanding in a more gradual way. and working not only on like Ken Wilber says, not only working on waking up, but also at growing up, more responsibility, cognitive skills, more perspectives, and cleaning up all my shadows, psychological issues, and on showing up in the world. So what do you think about this kind of this way of working on different developmental lines, and how does it relate to the question about direct path or gradual progressive path?
Just for those of you that are not familiar with these two terms, the direct path and the gradual or progressive path, let me just say something about that. The progressive or gradual path is the more traditional approach that you find in nearly all the religious and spiritual traditions, in which we don't go directly to our true nature, as we do here, but we go to our true nature via various steps or stages. In other words, an example of an indirect or gradual progressive approach would be, for instance, mantra meditation. By the way, I have nothing against mantra meditation. I practiced it for 25 years myself. This is not a criticism of the progressive path. It is just meant to be an explanation of it. So in mantra meditation, we don't go directly to the presence. We don't allow our attention to sink back or inwards into its source or essence, the presence of awareness. We direct our attention towards an object, in this case, a sound. Being devoted to a guru would be another example of the progressive path. And we're giving our attention to a person, not to ourself. So these are all paths, progressive paths, in which we give our attention to some kind of an object. And the purpose of these paths is to refine the energies of the mind until they are considered to be sufficiently subtle and pure to sink back into their source. That's the idea of the progressive path. In the end, the progressive path has to end up with the sinking of attention into its source, or the sinking of our devotion into its source, which is love. In the direct path, which was always available in most of these traditions, but was not often made explicit, we don't pay attention, at least to begin with, to the objective content of our experience, the condition of our body, our circumstances, our thought, because it is recognized that whatever our experience, we are aware of it. And therefore, awareness is present even in the most dysfunctional mind. And in this case, we go directly, that's why it's called the direct path, directly to the presence of awareness. Now, as you quite rightly point out, on the progressive path, there is a gradual purification of the mind and the body that takes place as we progress from object to object to object. And therefore, the cleaning up act, or the growing up act that you refer to, takes place as we develop along the progressive path. On the direct path, this cleaning up act does not take place on the way, because we're just going directly to our true nature, irrespective of how dysfunctional our mind or the state of our emotion may be. And you are quite right in pointing out that as a result of this, on the direct path, after the recognition of our true nature, there is what Francis once referred to as a post-enlightenment sadhana. That is the practice we do after the recognition of our true nature, which involves the realigning of the way we think and feel, and subsequently act and relate with this new understanding of ourself, what you refer to as cleaning up and growing up. So, loosely speaking, on the progressive path, the cleaning up process takes place prior to the recognition of our true nature. On the direct path, it takes place afterwards. That's a rather clinical analysis. In practice, it's a little bit of both, because although the direct path is direct, it doesn't mean that it's instantaneous. You can fly direct from Munich to London, or you can go indirect via Paris. But just because you go direct from Munich to London doesn't mean that it's instantaneous. It still takes time. So even in the direct path, this investigation of our true nature, it takes time, less time than the progressive path, to trace our way back to our true nature. So yes, if that there is more to this approach than simply the recognition of our true nature. I sometimes say that if the spiritual process were written in a book consisting of 12 chapters, the recognition of our true nature would take place at the end of chapter 1. It's just a stage. If it is considered to be the end, if there is no further development, then you are right. I would say it is incomplete. Now, just one more thing. These teachers that you refer to, who have so-called recognized their true nature, but behave in a way that is inconsistent with that recognition, and abuse people emotionally, financially, sexually, whatever. Is this a case of someone who has genuinely recognized their true nature and simply hasn't fully aligned their life with that recognition? At best, yes. However, I think that is a generous interpretation, because, and I would say that in this case, it's more likely that the person in question has had a genuine glimpse of their true nature, but is not stabilized in it. Because even if there are still some habits left over, the shadow that you refer to, if one is truly stable in one's experience or one's knowledge of oneself as the presence of awareness, it is not impossible, but very difficult to act in a way that is not consistent with that understanding. Because if one does begin to act in that way, something rises in oneself and says you're behaving in a way that is not consistent with your understanding. It happens quite quickly.